What if I told you that one of the most practical, down-to-earth guides for living out your faith was written by someone who, at first, didn't believe any of it? That's the fascinating puzzle at the heart of the book of James in the New Testament. It's a short, powerful book that really gets straight to the point. But to really get its message, we've got to solve a mystery first. Who exactly was James? So the letter opens up pretty simply. James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. The problem? Well, that doesn't exactly narrow it down, does it? There are at least 4 major figures named James in the New Testament. So, yeah. Which James are we talking about here? And you might be wondering, why does this even matter? Who cares which James it is? Well, it matters a lot, because whoever wrote this letter says things that, on the surface, look like a direct contradiction to the Apostle Paul. Paul is famous for saying we're saved by faith. James comes along and says faith without deeds is dead. So, are these two guys arguing, or are they just looking at the same truth from different angles? To figure that out, we have to know who we're listening to. All right, let's put on our detective hats. We're going to go through the main suspects one by one and just use a process of elimination to figure out who wrote this really challenging letter. So first up is James, the son of Zebedee, brother of the Apostle John. A huge figure, right? He was part of Jesus's inner circle, Peter, James, and John. But here's the thing. The book of Acts tells us he was executed by King Herod really early on in the church's history. The timeline just doesn't work. So, nope, can't be him. He's off the list. Okay, next on the list, we've actually got 2 more apostles named James. There's James, the son of Alphaeus. Sometimes they call him James the Lesser. And then there's James, the father of the apostle Judas. And no, not that Judas. The thing is, we just don't know much about these guys. I mean, it's possible one of them is our author, but the evidence for our final candidate is just so much stronger, and honestly, it's a way better story. And that leaves us with the one person pretty much everyone agrees wrote this letter. James, the half-brother of Jesus Christ himself. Yeah, just let that sink in for a second. This incredibly direct, no-nonsense letter about what real faith looks like was written by someone who literally grew up in the same house as Jesus. But here's the real kicker, the part that's just mind-blowing. During Jesus' ministry on earth, his own family, including James, were skeptics. The Gospel of John tells us that not even his brothers believed in him. They basically thought he was getting a little carried away, maybe a little nuts. They just did not take him seriously. So the big question is, how on earth does that guy, a family skeptic who grew up with Jesus and still doubted him, turn into a pillar of the early church, writing with this kind of authority? It's seriously one of the most stunning turnarounds in the entire Bible. His journey is just remarkable. He starts out as a total non-believer, and then bam, something happens that changes his entire life. The Apostle Paul tells us in his letter to the Corinthians that the resurrected Jesus appeared personally to James. Can you even imagine that? That one encounter must have just turned his entire world upside down. He goes from doubter to devout, and in just a couple of decades, he's so respected he's the one leading the church through its first major crisis. And listen, we're not talking about some small disagreement here. This was huge. The Council of Jerusalem was dealing with a controversy that could have literally split the church in 2. The debate was about whether non-Jews who wanted to follow Jesus had to basically become Jewish first, meaning circumcision, following all the laws of Moses, the whole shebang. The entire identity of this new faith was hanging in the balance. So you've got Peter, Paul, Barnabas, everyone's making their case. And then James stands up. And it's James, the former skeptic, who delivers the final decisive verdict. He declares that the Gentiles don't need to be burdened with all that, confirming that salvation is a gift of grace. In that one moment, he becomes the voice of unity, and he opens the door for Christianity to become a faith for the entire world. Okay, so now that we know who we're dealing with, this incredible leader who started out as a skeptic, we can finally go back and solve that big problem we started with. That whole tension between Paul's faith and James's works. To unlock this whole thing, we just need to understand one key word: justification. It sounds like a big theological term, but all it means is being made right with God. And here's the secret. Both Paul and James use this word, but they're using it to answer 2 totally different questions. So here it is, the big reveal. They aren't contradicting each other at all. Think of it this way. Paul is talking about our legal standing before God. He's answering the question, how am I made right with God? And his answer is faith alone.
It's an inside job that God sees. But James is talking about our practical standing before other people. He's asking, how does anyone else know my faith is real? And his answer is by your actions, by what you do. It's the outside proof. They're just two sides of the exact same coin, no contradiction.
So, with all that sorted out, we can finally get to the heart of what James is really saying. See, he's not anti-faith. Not at all. He's anti a lazy faith, a faith that just sits there and doesn't do anything. He is all about a faith that is alive, a faith you can actually see in how someone lives their life.
You know, the author and teacher Chuck Missler shared this really jarring observation from his time working as an executive in the corporate world. He said he found more character, more people whose word was their bond, out in the secular world than he did inside the church. Ouch. And that is exactly the kind of hypocrisy that drove James crazy and what he's tackling head on in this letter.
And if you want proof of how practical this guy is, just look at the numbers. In this short little letter, only 108 verses, he packs in 60 direct commands. That's more than one command every 2 verses. He is not messing around with abstract ideas. He's giving us a clear, no-nonsense, how-to guide for living. And James just dives right in. He doesn't waste a single second. Right near the beginning of his letter, he says something that sounds completely insane. He tells his readers to count it all joy when they face all kinds of trials and temptations. Seriously? Joy? From hardship? How does that even work? Well, James says these trials aren't just random, meaningless pain. They're part of a process that has a purpose. He lays it out like this. You go through a tough time. That tough time tests your faith. If you hang in there and endure it, that test produces patience. And what's the end result of all that patience? Spiritual maturity, wholeness. So in other words, God uses the difficulties of life not to break us, but to build us. The suffering itself isn't the point. The character that it produces is the point. The goal, as James puts it, is to make us perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. It's kind of like a refinery for our faith, you know? It burns away all the junk and leaves behind something strong and pure. And this all leads up to the central challenge of the entire book, and it completely reframes how we should think about the Christian experience. See, way too often we treat a decision of faith like it's the finish line, the climax of the story. James argues that's completely backward. That decision, it's not the end, it's the very beginning. And so James leaves us with this really penetrating question. It is not enough to just say you believe. He forces us to look in the mirror and ask ourselves, is my faith alive? Is it visible? Does it actually result in action, in good character, in integrity? You've made a decision of faith. The real question is, what have you done with it?